I'm on my way home from running some errands, and I'm holding something in my hand that shouldn't exist. It's a game manual. You know, the little booklets that came on the inside cover of games up until about the mid-2000s or so? This is the game manual for the 2023 indie game, The Banished Vault. It is a thinky, brutal, number-crunchy, minimalist game about space exploration. And that might not be for everyone, but what is really fascinating and unique in its own way is that this is a physical manual for an entirely digital game. A game released over a decade after physical manuals all but entirely disappeared from shelves and games altogether. It is a relic of a foregone era of gaming, an object that should not exist. So why does it? And what does that mean about the role that physical game manuals might play in the future of games? I'm Max Neal, and this is Voxel. I remember the bubbling excitement of the long car ride home from the game store as a kid. The only thing that could settle me was cracking open the case of my new game and tucking into the pages of its manual. Inside was this pulpy, plasticky smell that unfolded into the secrets of the world that I'd soon be exploring. Reading the game manual on the way home was one of my rituals. It was sacred. But almost all at once, game manuals vanished from games entirely. The death of the game manual was quiet. Something that was considered to be so commonplace really disappeared without ever leaving even a note, and I know that a lot of us noticed. The first time I opened a game and saw an empty space inside where the manual should have been, it felt like part of the game was missing, like a texture hadn't rendered properly, but in the real world. That's because there was an art to the game manual, and I don't just mean the art on the cover or spread across its pages. Creating game manuals was an art form. Their job was to educate you on their controls and set the stage for the world you were about to enter. Some even offered hints and tips for the game itself, and every game approached that task differently. Pikmin 2's colorful pages were arranged as if to be used by Olimar himself. 007, Everything or Nothing, was as scantily clad as its female cast. SimCity 4's manual, on the other hand, was a big ol' thick boy, and implicated in a series of murders across the Bay Area from 2003 to 2005. Manuals were the answer to a hobby that was growing increasingly more complex and reaching a new audience of first-time gamers. Before in-game tutorials became the norm, manuals taught the basic controls and acted as a point of reference for complex concepts and systems in the game. In fact, if we were to pin the death of the game manual on any one thing specifically, in-game tutorials and rules references are our prime culprit. With the ability to teach a game's control scheme baked into the first moments of gameplay, developers are now able to achieve a more active learning experience, that is, learning through doing, rather than learning through reading. By doing so, one half of the responsibility of the game manual is made entirely obsolete, and that's a good thing. Even complex games today have thorough in-game references and repeatable tutorials, so there's really little need for a physical reference at all. That, and the manual had another major limitation baked into it: the cost and effort required to update it. Any change to a major game mechanic meant that you also had to change and reprint the manual. Plus, game controls were becoming increasingly customizable, with rebindable hotkeys on PC and controller presets on console. A game manual might be a handy one-off reference, but one that was immutable, unpatchable, and eventually replaced by in-game menus. So fine. Rip out the control scheme pages. Manuals were a brilliant introduction to the world of the game. They could tease details about its inhabitants, provide lore and tips about vehicles or weapons, even prime the player about the world that they were about to explore. Think about it. In most games, you play as a character who's lived in this world for some amount of time. Wouldn't you already know a thing or two about their hometown? Isn't it a bit weird that our characters wake up one day and constantly are asking amnesic questions about the world around them? Manuals invited you into the game world by sharing some carefully selected background knowledge, and they primed the player. And admittedly, this wouldn't work with every game. Take Elden Ring, for example. The player character returns to the Lands Between after being banished for some years, and so it's no wonder that we start the game knowing next to nothing about how this land and its characters came to be. But for other games, or for sequels or spin-offs, it's a bit odd for returning players for games to have to rehash various mechanics and foundational world building right at the start. It makes me appreciate the approach of games like God of War Ragnarok, which starts off right in the action with almost no explanation at all about where or even when you are. but its story is crafted in such a way that it doesn't quite matter if you remember every detail from the game before it. And this brings up an interesting question, one that I don't know the answer to. Maybe you do, and if so, you should let me know in the comments. But if manuals were removed from games, not only because of in-game tutorials, but because of their cost of production, are publishers really saving money by building custom tutorials or by having to explain minute details through cutscenes or dialogue? Don't get me wrong, I will take an immersive world that unveils itself through gameplay over games that require me to read bloated paragraphs of text any day of the week. I've played plenty of games whose worlds unfold beautifully to the player through the use of careful exposition. Games where half of the experience is that wondrous joy of not knowing anything at all. Yet, many others have taken to explaining the world through scraps of paper inextricably littered about, or 3-page journals that describe a side character's importance to the plot. It's a somewhat lazy form of world building that by now has become a trope in video games, and I'm kind of bored of it. That's not to say that a physical manual would do any better. I'll admit, in many ways, a game manual might be worse than what we can accomplish in games today. But there's a game that stands out and shows that maybe there's still a place for game manuals in the modern era. Tunic is an isometric adventure game heavily inspired by The Legend of Zelda, where players go about puzzling and piecing a world back together by finding new tools and abilities, fighting monsters, and collecting and deciphering pages of a digital guide that plays a major role in the player's understanding of the world and the game that they're playing. The manual contains what you would expect from its physical counterpart: the game's control scheme, some tips and tricks, descriptions of different iconography, and more than that. You'll find pages with maps updated with your character's location and discoveries on them as you explore. You'll find little hints and teasers and reminders for ability combos and ways of interacting with the world and the use of different items. And you'll often receive pages describing regions that you've never visited before. I found the map of the Frogman's domain before I even ever knew that the Frogmen had a domain or that there were Frogmen here at all. And that drove me to go out and find them. The manual in Tunic isn't just an in-game tutorial or a reference, it is an important and integral part of playing the game. And if it weren't obvious enough already that the digital manual was a throwback to a past era of gaming, if you tilt the right analog stick while reading the manual in-game, it reveals a low-fidelity version of the game displayed on a TV behind it, as a sort of way to make up for the fact that you aren't holding the manual in your own hands. I love this kind of stuff. Not only does the game reward the player for exploring every nook and cranny, it encourages you to do it in ways that few games today take the opportunity to do. But physical manuals can fulfill something that in-game manuals can't. Flipping through the pages of the manual for the Banished Vault, the book is full of references and reminders of the game's various ship types and its use of minimalist iconography, and if you flip far enough in, there's nothing. Literally nothing, just a series of blank-lined pages. What's the deal? I sat down with the game's designer, Nick Tringali, to find out why, and to find out why this even exists in the first place.
If you imagine like the Banished Vault with a kind of traditional step-by-step tutorial, it would probably be like, at least an hour or 2 hours or whatever, right? Of like, okay, here's how you move, here's what every resource does, here are different ways you go to a planet or what you do at a planet, blah, blah, blah. And so by the end of that 2 hours, I personally would not, I would just be kind of sick of it or whatever, right? Especially of reading like snippets of text at like the game's speed. With the manual, the idea being like, okay, go to the manual, there's a page that in, very, very plain language, right? It's not, it is very much, if I was sitting next to you showing you the game, how would I say it, right? And it's like, that's how it works. And, we have like wonderful, wonderful art that just makes it like lovely to look at, which also helps.
I often talk about immersion in the context of games as something achieved by the game itself. Its use of visuals and sounds, tight controls, its believability in the face of the unimaginable. But the Banished Vault accomplished immersion in a unique way through a level of physicality with its manual. You're tasked with guiding the crew of an interstellar Gothic monastery to safety across a hostile universe. You're escaping collapsing star systems, and worse, the folly of your own miscalculations. It's a game about planning ahead and maximizing every turn to make sure you can return to your ship in time with enough fuel and supplies and your crew to make it to the next jump through space. It's mathy, and your mistakes are costly. Spend one turn too many trying to eke out an extra resource, and you might need to abandon one of your exiles to their fate on a distant planet. Every encounter in the Banished Vault is like that scene from Interstellar with the tidal wave, and you're responsible for the outcome. Return to the vault without enough stasis to put your exiles into hibernation, and it's game over for them, and for you. Success requires careful calculations and careful planning. Planning that looks like this. Those empty pages in my manual are filled with otherwise nonsensical scribbles, checks and double checks, frantic scratchings out of plans gone just a little bit awry. Typically in games like these, I might use a friendly notepad window, or if I've really drunk the Kool-Aid, an entire Excel spreadsheet. But the empty lines in the latter half of the Banished Vault's manual were there to be used. And so I used them. And in doing so, I was a scribe, locked away somewhere in that hulking monastery, responsible for planning our trip perfectly for the sake of my brothers and sisters, each one of them risking everything for our survival. That is immersion. Much like how haptic feedback in controllers is designed to trick your physical senses, writing in a notebook accomplished a level of immersion that's kind of hard to come by in a minimalistic simulation game. You don't only lose track of the hours you've spent playing, but you're physically feeling it. You're acting and doing something outside of the game for the sake of what amounts to a few pixels on a screen. Pixels that will flicker off forever when I finally close and uninstall the game. And after that, all that's going to remain of the Banished Vault are my memories of it and its manual. The Banished Vault's not alone. Celeste included a manual in its limited edition of the game on the Switch. Cyberpunk 2077 included a booklet in physical copies of the game too. Even Tunic printed a hardcover copy of the in-game instruction book. And you might be still watching and thinking, so what? This is all just bloat, it's just stuff. In-game tutorials do it better, and that's fair. But the existence of game manuals and collector's editions today in 2024 is proof that some players still want a physical connection to their digital games. 20 years after physical manuals all but completely disappeared, I'm looking back on my life and appreciating in a new way how physical games used to be. The touch of that plasticky paper, the smell of a newly opened game, those little micro-moment sounds of opening a game and putting a disc into a console. It sounds materialistic and shallow and all of the worst parts of our capitalistic society, I know, but holding something in your hands feels good. You might not love these things now, maybe you've never even thought about them before, but as mundane as they sound, they evoke our senses in ways that have the power to create long-lasting memories. And someday in the future, like what just happened to me, they might bring you back to times that you remember fondly. These artifacts are disappearing. Manuals were gone, and then the CD drive. Most of us buy games entirely digitally now. In 10 to 20 years, there may be little left at all in gaming to touch or smell or hear. Now, I have a remarkably terrible memory. And by now, I've played several hundreds, if not over 1,000 games. There have been games that defined my childhood that I no longer remember anything about. I'm left with this vague memory of how they made me feel, or with brief recollections of scenes without any context to them. And so I relish reminders of the games and experiences that were worth having. I wrapped up my gameplay of the Banished Vault and I uninstalled the game. But its manual is a reminder of the art and passion poured into this hobby, that it can transcend this digital transactional space, that it can inspire, just like it captured and inspired a young kid with a game manual in his hands on a car ride home many years ago.